Good evening, everybody. My name is Guy Harewood, and I'm chair of the Stirling and Clackmannanshire SWT Local Group. In a moment, I'll hand over to Liz Albert, who will be chairing this evening's talk. But first, I just want to mention a few things about the webinar itself to help you enjoy the best possible experience. Firstly, we're recording the webinar. So please bear that in mind. When you're posting questions and comments, the webinar will be available to view on the SWT YouTube channel after this event's finished. If you have any problems or comments, please post these using the chat function. I'll keep an eye on the chat during the webinar, as will fellow committee members. And if you have any questions for Tom, please post these in the Q&A function, not in the chat function. And if you see any questions that you find interesting, please like these, as the most popular questions will rise to the top of the list and be answered first. So thanks again for joining us. I hope you enjoy the talk, and I'll pass you over to Liz Albert.
Hello and welcome everybody. This is our third webinar hosted by the Scottish Wildlife Trust headquarters and our group this winter. Our talk this evening is on nature-friendly farming, and our speaker is Tom Bowser, head ranger from Argaty Red Kites. His talk tonight is very different from the one he gave recently on conservation of red kites, red squirrels and dragonflies at Argaty. So I just wanted to say a little bit about why we chose this topic. Earlier, we had learned of the Nature Friendly Farming Network UK, and someone who's a member of that, I only know him or her by their Twitter handle, so it's @Whitmuir1, is a Scottish member of that organisation. He tweets about all sorts of things to do with biodiversity on his farm. Really interesting. He does a lot of surveying work as well. So we'd learned a bit about that. Then earlier this year, we had a talk from Sandra Stewart, and that was actually on behalf of the Forth Rivers Trust, but she also does work with farmers on how they can best encourage biodiversity on their farms. And that was really interesting to hear about that. So that was another factor. Then, of course, we knew that we were going to be leaving the EU, and that would be an opportunity for changes to be made in farming policy and farming subsidies. And that seems like a really, really important thing to be happening. So we're interested in it for that reason as well. And then just as a last minute extra thing, Scottish Wildlife Trust headquarters and the National Farmers Union for Scotland are just about to launch an initiative called Champions for Change, and there's a launch event tomorrow online, and this is going to be about showcasing, I think, good practice by farmers and crofters who are trying really hard to help biodiversity in lots of ways on their farms. So all in all, it seemed like a good time for us to try and learn a bit more about this. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Tom, our speaker, but just to remind you, if you want to make general comments or you've got any IT problems, please use the chat facility. If you've got a question that you want Tom to answer at the questions and answer time, please use the Q&A facility. Okay, it'll be along the menu on the bottom of your screen, or if you're on an iPad, it will be along the top of your screen. Right, so I think that's me finished my bit for tonight. And so we look forward to Tom's presentation tonight, and I'm going to hand you over to him now.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Liz and Guy. Just see if I can get the technology working. Let's share screen. Liz, Guy, perhaps you could give me a thumbs up and just let me know that that's coming up on your screen, okay? Excellent, excellent. Right, hello folks, thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Thanks again to the SWT for inviting me along to speak to you. It's always nice to do these things, and just sorry we can't do it in person. Tonight, folks, I'm going to tell you some stories about my home, Argaty, and the way that we manage the estate, the way that we farm it, the way that we try and make a home for wildlife here. That's going to be the first half of the talk. The second half, I'm going to go off on a slight tangent and look at some of the problems that are arising with farming and the environment. Try and look at maybe where these problems have come from and things that we can do as farmers and that you can do as consumers to maybe try and make a bit of a difference and try and get things on a bit more of an even keel. So the talk will be divided into two halves, folks. But for a start, let me tell you a bit about my home. So Argaty, oh, sorry guys, seems like I can't change the slides. Always a technical hitch in this. Let me try this again. There we go. Argaty is located between Doune and Doune, so about 20 minutes north of Stirling and an hour north of Glasgow and Edinburgh. We're a 1,400 acre sheep and beef farm. Now, our part of the world is traditionally known as the gateway to the Highlands. And on our land, you can really see where the two landscapes meet. Half of the place is nice grass parks, and then the other half is the complete opposite, big, wide, rushy moorland, suitable really only for grazing of hardy native breeds of sheep and cattle. If you know us already, folks, you probably know us for our Red Kite project, our red squirrel hides, and our summer wildlife walks, dragonfly walks, moth trapping events and such like. And as Liz said in the introduction, if you want to know more about that, I did a talk for the Calendar SWT group that's on the SWT website now. So if you want to know more about those things, please do look that up. But tonight, for the first part, let's focus on some of the habitats that support this incredible array of wildlife. The first thing that people will notice about Argaty when they visit is the number of trees that we have here. Oaks, Scots pine, great big beech trees that have stood for over 2 centuries. We have a lot of trees here, and as a result, we have a lot of insects, and we also have a lot of birds. Of course, we have red kites, kestrels. In the last couple of years, a pair of ospreys have taken up residence here. We'll get every type of raptor breeding here with the exception of white-tailed eagles and golden eagles, although I'm sure the former will end up with us soon enough. In total, there's been over 100 different species of bird noted on the estate. So we've got a good habitat then. On Argaty, our woodland makes up somewhere in the region of about 360 acres, so there is a lot of trees. But trees on their own, woods are all good and well, but without something joining them up, wildlife seems to struggle. So in the last decade, we've put in 3.5 kilometres of hedgerow around the edge of our fields, trying to link up the various different woods on the place. So about 2/3 of the estate, the woods there, are joined by these hedgerows. Now, these obviously they benefit the wildlife that are in the woods, which are either trapped in woods that don't have hedgerow corridors, or they have to run the gauntlet with predators and move out into the fields. So the big benefits giving them free passage between areas, but the benefit for our livestock is just as great. This picture illustrates it quite well. Before we put the hedgerows in, we had bare fences like everyone else. And on a wet, windy night in the lambing fields here, we would quite often lose lambs to the elements. Now we have shelter, and some of you may or may not know, I don't want to be teaching Granny to suck eggs in this talk, but just to explain, a lot of the time when ewes give birth, they'll go to the edge of the field to somewhere quiet to give birth. And now they're doing that right next to a great big hedgerow, which is great. This is one of our smaller hedgerow corridors here. Some of them are about twice my height, so they're really, really impressive the way that they're grown. It's all things like hawthorn, blackthorn with oak trees, rowans, loads of things that are going to provide good food and shelter for the small birds over the winter period. As well as the hedgerows, you can see in the background of this picture that's perhaps better illustrated. We're allowing a lot of scrub to develop on the estate as well. So hedgerows, as you probably know, are really quite a human construct, developed when we started enclosing fields as a way of marking the space between people's land. Before that, what we had was scrub. That's where these things were found, all these things like the hawthorn bushes and such like. And we're allowing that to develop on the edge of the woods to make a good home for wildlife again. We have now 2.5 acres of wildflower meadows. First one there, so I'll go back to that for a second. This year we had this glorious crop of red campion that came up in the 2-acre patch. Really, really great. And Liz mentioned Sandra Stewart, who got us a grant to put in a further 1/2 acre at the back of the red kite hide this year, which came up amazingly well. Lots of cornflower, yarrow, fat hen, all sorts of things in there, making a great home for lots of pollinators here. On top of that, we try very much to let the wildflowers that we didn't put in just flower. This time of year, the whole place looks a bit overgrown and tatty, but of course, these decaying flowers are providing good food and shelter for insects still. In the spring and summertime, it's just magnificent with all these oxeye daisies coming up. We are trying very much to link habitats in other ways besides allowing scrub to develop. One of the things that we did in lockdown, this is our head ranger, 6-year-old Rowan, my daughter, who was dragged out pretty much every day in lockdown to do some kind of boring conservation task with Daddy. So this one was planting buddleia between our wildflower meadows, so providing a really good source of nectar for butterflies so that then they could move around between the areas and into the wider countryside where they can be met by the hills and this glorious, glorious crop of gorse. You can probably imagine, folks, the smell of this when it's in flower. You can probably imagine the sound as well. In the spring and summertime, the hill just rings with birdsong. Now, gorse, for some farmers, this would be an absolute disaster, but I suppose we're lucky that we have enough space that we can allow gorse to spread. It gives great shelter for the birds, which benefits our wildlife side of the business. And it also will give a bit of shelter to the livestock as well. One thing, and this is looking way, way, way into the future, but we know eventually there'll be a point where we have white-tailed eagles here and they'll come down, and I think things like gorse, we know at clipping time when we go to shear the sheep how much they love to go and wriggle around in the gorse. Yeah, hands end up like a pincushion because they spend so much time in there. And I think that when it comes to time that we have eagles here, we might be quite glad of the fact that we have gorse here as a bit of shelter. So that's looking way, way into the future. But we know eagles are spreading, and we hope that this will give our livestock a bit of shelter and protection as well as giving the wildlife some food as well. One thing I should have said earlier, folks, another benefit that we have, that we get from having hedgerows, having so many trees, so much vegetation on our farm, and we also, by the way, have trees in the middle of fields, as you saw from one of the earlier pictures. But this, when these things drop their leaves, it will give us a good natural source of nitrogen that will help fertilize the grass as well. So one of the things I'll come to later on is about trying to find natural ways of reducing input and boosting the productivity of your fields. And having vegetation is definitely one of those things that really, really helps. So all of this, folks, makes a great habitat for nature. Bumblebees, pollinators, and of course the birds. If trees are the first thing that you would notice on Argaty, then the second thing following swiftly afterwards would be the birds. All sorts, from the raptors down to the passerines, dunnocks, robins, tits, and my personal favourite, the tree sparrows that we have here. We're very, very lucky in the early days of our Red Kite project when my parents had the hive built in 2003. We got help from the local RSPB members group who helped us to plant loads of hawthorn bushes in around the hide, lots of hazels as well, giving great thorny shelter for small birds, bringing back things that would have been on farmland previously, but certainly weren't on our farm to such an extent back then, and certainly aren't on many farms now. So these things, we brought them back, and with them came this amazing number of tree sparrows, which love these thorny bushes. We've tried to help them out a bit more in recent times, again continuing this idea of trying to have connected habitat by building hundreds of bird boxes and putting them up around the place. Tree sparrows being a communal bird, they've taken them up really, really well. And again, these boxes will be ringing out with the sound of tree sparrow chicks through the spring and summer period, which is lovely. Besides that, we have 16 ponds on the farm, the most recent of which we put in lockdown again here. So this corner of the field was an area that really did us no good at all. In fact, it did our farming quite a lot of damage in a lot of ways. You can maybe see in, just by hovering the mouse over here, in the back edge of this pond here, this is where we dug it out to allow a broken field drain to fill up this pond properly. This was always a very wet patch of the field, and because it was wet, it made the ideal breeding conditions for a parasite called fluke, which can be fatal to your livestock when they ingest it. It does really well in these kind of damp, miserable corners of the field. So it was really no good for cultivation, and it did a lot of harm to our livestock. We have to dose for fluke because we can be quite bad for that here, so that increases our inputs. Really, this recorder was doing us no good at all. So my dad had this idea that instead of just continually doing battle with the elements, what we should do was just get the digger in, dig it out, make a pond and fence it off, keep the livestock out of there, and we've created a habitat as well. As I say, it's our 16th pond on the place. So we're letting this one basically rewild itself from now. We've put in a few plants that I've dug in from different ponds, but really we're just going to let it be and see what happens with it. But it makes a great habitat, as you can imagine, for all sorts of amphibians and insects. Now, that's enough probably for now about the wider habitat management on the place. Let's get into some of the nitty-gritty about farming itself. Nature-friendly farming on Argaty. So we have a flock of about 650 ewes here and a herd of 60 cattle. We're using native breeds for both, and that's really important for a place like us with a lot of slightly more impoverished ground, I suppose you would call it. The technical term would be that we have a lot of LFA, less favoured area, which is an EU term used to denote areas where food production is hampered by natural hindrances. And so yeah, a lot of our hill is really suitable only for grazing by very hardy native breeds mentioned earlier. So our cattle, we run an Aberdeen Angus bull and the Highland Shorthorn bull. These are some of our Angus cows here. They'll be spending the winter, they are right now in fact, up on the hill here grazing away. And at this time of year, coming into December, we will take them in and we'll dose them for fluke, the parasite that I mentioned earlier. Try and get this work done in this period, so that then by the time that we reach the insect and bird breeding season in spring, all those medicines will pass out of the body through the manure, and the wildlife won't be picking up on anything, any kind of medicinal things. I should have said this earlier, folks, that we aren't an organic farm. We try and be very, very minimal, handle all this with a very light touch and not use too many inputs. But for a place like us, we will have problems with fluke and such like if we don't try and do things to remedy that. So we do a bit of dosing for that. Our ethos, which passed on down from my dad to me, which our contractors who do most of the farming work here share, is that we should try and do our best to prevent our livestock from getting ill rather than acting to treat them when they do become ill. So That's the main reason why we aren't organic, but in a lot of ways we're really quite similar. We try and do as little as we can on an artificial basis, I suppose you would say. So anyway, to return to the cows, these animals are really the heart of our hill ecosystem here. And I know there's been a lot of very bad press about cows in particular recently, but I feel sometimes like a lot of the good stories about them have been missed out. And one of the main benefits that we have is the work that they're doing right now. When they're up on the hill, they're trampling down rushes, they're eating long grass, and they are also eating up the decaying seeds of wildflowers up on the hill, spreading them out again through their manure. We take them off the hill in the springtime, just in time for those seeds to germinate and us to get this amazing crop of early purple orchids coming out, which are only there because of cows spreading their seeds and getting rid of the competing vegetation up there. All that is because of the cattle. The other thing, of course, that they're doing with these mighty cow packs that they're spreading around up there is they're providing a good supply of food for smaller birds and beetles and all such things. The result of which is that we have a huge number of birds like meadow pipits, skylarks and such like. And we'll see an added benefit to that again in springtime when cuckoos return to Britain. Last year, I think we had 3 pairs of cuckoos up on the hill. And I'm sure it's no coincidence that we have so many meadow pipits, which the cuckoos, whose nests they parasite out. All these things are linked and all these things are there because of the cows. As I say, there's a lot of negative press, I think, surrounding cattle. A lot of it is justified, but I feel like some of these good stories are sometimes missed out, and they're important. The other thing I should have said, folks, when I mentioned that the cows were native breeds, the important thing about that is that they are suited to spend all winter out on the hill. They're not like some of these continental breeds that have in Scotland and some farms, which sneeze every time there's rain and need a lot more feed, a lot more care, a lot more input to keep them going. These cows can be out on the hill at the moment. They can be providing a dung for beetles and birds all the way through this season. So that's important to us. Other things we're doing on the farm to try and farm well and produce a good home for nature. We've put in a lot of new grass recently, and we plan to put in a lot more in the coming years as well, trying primarily to make our farming more efficient, more productive, putting in good new grass that grows well and is palatable to the livestock. But we try and put in, if we can get the weather for it anyway, it relies a bit on getting good weather for it to take. But we try and put in a high clover mix when we're putting in our grass mix. Clover, as you'll know, is great for pollinators, particularly the bees absolutely love it. But it's also very, very good for getting the grass to take. It's a natural source of nitrogen, which again reduces the need to use so many fertilizers. It helps the sward to grow. All these things really, really positive, and the livestock absolutely love to eat it. So all these things work out really well. Again, this is, I suppose, in a way, just kind of smart farming. You know, these things make sense, and they can add a really good life for wildlife as well. So we've put in so far, we've put in 12 acres of clover, and all of our next 3 seeds will have a high clover mix in there. For years now, my dad has been putting in this plant, which some of you might recognise. It always makes me laugh when people pronounce it quinoa, because we've always known it as quinoa. And farmers, you know, they tend to, again, maybe a bit like things like gorse, they tend to kind of look down on things like this and think it's a weed. But my dad's always thrown it in, and it is a great wee weed to have in your mix. Doesn't do any harm to your field, and when the seed head drops, we'll get huge numbers of finches coming in and feeding on that. So that's a good thing to add to the mix. Yep. Returning to the theme of trying to reduce inputs on the place, when we bale our silage, we'll get all of that analysed, and it'll tell us the nutrient contents of each bale, which gives us an idea of the rations we need to buy in, the feed we need to buy in, top up cows when they're in at breeding time, having the calves in the shed just to keep them going. We're all, as farmers, with all the changes that are happening with subsidy, everyone's going to have to get smarter about how they spend their money simply to survive. In addition, you know, a lot of farms are, not us incidentally, but a lot of farms are bringing in a lot of feed, which can have a bit of a harmful impact on the environment. And, you know, this is something, again, that farming is going to have to really look at and see how do we reduce the need for the feed. And this is one of the things, it's making sure that you're only actually bringing in what you need. So that's part of what we're doing, is making sure that we know exactly how much we need, because we've analysed the silage, and our cows, when they're in the shed, will get a mix of just the right feed and then the silage that they need. I mentioned earlier briefly, folks, that we have contractors here. It's a point I probably should have made at the beginning, is that everything I'm saying to you tonight is not an expert view by any means. I've done farming in the past, but we now have people in that do the livestock management for us, a very nice local couple who are very sympathetic to our wildlife goals for the estate. This lets me get on with the conservation work that I want to do with the place, and we work quite well in harmony together. So everything I'm saying to you tonight is opinions of someone who's done a little bit of farming, but really more than anything else, it's not an expert opinion. It's just someone that lives in the countryside and makes his living from the countryside in a few views. I do want to kind of make that clear. I'm also, the other disclaimer I should probably add while we're at it is that you will hear a lot about the good side of livestock farming tonight. I'm also aware that when I'm talking to a wildlife audience, there might be some people listening that you know, do find eating meat ethically dubious. That's absolutely fine. You know, I'm not trying to kind of change your mind on any of these things. All I'm trying to do is highlight some of the good things about livestock farming in Scotland that I think might be missed out. And hopefully it'll give us enough to have a bit of a discussion at the end. So anyway, disclaimers over. Move on to a few other things about our farming practice. So I suppose in a way, ironically, now we're realising that ploughing land, the plough is something that I guess in a way civilization has been built on. Food production certainly has been built on ploughing and being able to turn over our land and start again whenever we want. But now we're realising that each time we put the plough into the ground, we're breaking up a whole ecosystem down there, bacterial relations that have been going on, insect life and all these things. Each time we plough it, we're smashing that up and starting again. And it's one of the things that's become really, really dangerous, I think, with the intensification of farming that's happened in the last, say, 50 years, to put a date on it. A lot of farms have really almost become a monoculture where they're just producing one thing. And if you are on a fairly intensive arable farm and you're ploughing it every year, each year you're smashing up that relationship that's going on beneath your feet. Each year you're destroying your soil health a little bit more, releasing carbon into the atmosphere, all these things. And this is one of the things, again, with some problems that we're facing as an industry and environmentally generally, that we're really going to have to address. So one of the things we have done in recent years here is we bought a seed drill, one of these things. This is a stock photo that looks very similar to the one we have, as a way of putting in our brassica crops. So we try and put stubble turnips, for example, into the ground each year, again, to reduce our need to bring in food. And we put it in with a seed drill, which will distribute the seeds evenly across the ground, rolling it out evenly so we get a good take. But it also really, for want of a better way of putting it, just tickles the seeds into the soil. So you're going through and you're not having that big, massive impact that a plough might have on the ground. So hopefully making a bit less havoc by doing it this way. So that's one of the things we've been doing recently. Move on now, folks, to talk a wee bit more about why all of this matters. Or to put it another way, why are we even talking about this? I think the whole idea of discussing the environment, biodiversity on farms, etc., would have been totally unthinkable a few generations ago. But as we all know, things have changed hugely, and having wildlife on a farm, which was just taken as a given in the middle of the last century, you know, that's very much not a given now. Things have really changed. The stats bear all this out. This is our woodland cover compared to the rest of Europe. Not looking great. Nor, unfortunately, are our wetland statistics. Or indeed our hedgerow stats. And again, wildflowers, most of our wildflower meadows gone, and most of it really in recent decades. And the result of this inevitably is the crashing biodiversity that we all know about. Simply what we've done over this period is we have kicked nature out of its home and just left it to starve. It's a really, really sad story. And for us farmers, the stats really don't make particularly happy reading, because we know that farmland makes up 70% of the UK's landmass, up to somewhere in the region of 75 in Scotland. So for us as farmers, we can't escape the fact that this has largely happened on our watch. This leads then to the next question of how this happened. And when we're debating that, that tends to lead to a lot of this. I like to think of this as a farmer and a conservationist having a bit of a go at each other. We seem to have a lot of blame coming towards farmers, and I think, you know, it's hard for us to escape the fact that a lot of this is justified because it's happened on our land and our fields year upon year until we've reached this point. I think where it's coming from is the fact that we're all worried, or at least if people aren't worried, they certainly should be. But I think that's what's driving it, and everyone is looking for a reason for it, someone to blame, and you know, things are getting probably made worse, I would say, by social media, and also some of the mainstream media as well. I'm sure a lot of you watched the George Monbiot programme about meat production, and also the Liz Bonham one. Interestingly, the Liz Bonham one I hadn't realised until recently, but that was the one that focused on global agriculture and the kind of really, really horrific intensive practices that you see in some parts of the United States with the big feedlots and all the soil that's being fed to them and all these things, the pollution that's coming from that. Really, really worrying. What it didn't do though, and what these arguments don't always do, is focus on some of the good things about farming that we've already talked about tonight, and I want to say a bit more about it. When I watch these shows, I find myself feeling really, really down for probably about 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, thinking, oh my God, we are ruining everything, it's our fault. And then I stopped and I thought, well, hang on a sec, that doesn't look like my farm. You know, the things I'm seeing on these shows, these big, empty deserts, big green deserts, didn't look like my farm, didn't feel like my farm. And I think those are the things that they missed out on. And I hadn't realised until speaking to my cousin who farms up north that the Liz Bonham show had actually been removed by the BBC after it upheld complaints by the NFU about bias towards UK farming. So what I worry about with these shows is that they lead to more of this, more people shouting at each other, just make things worse instead of shining a light on where we actually go from here. You know, so that would be my concern with them. They raise a lot of valid points though about the intensity of global farming and sort of the real problems we have with that. So this isn't me sticking the boot in, but I do think, you know, they probably do need to be a bit more rounded and show some of the better sides of things. But what's driving this? This is the other thing I think they perhaps miss out on a bit with all of this, which we really need to look at. Because while we farmers do deserve some degree of blame, great degree of blame, I'm sure, there are other bigger forces, I think, that have been pushing this on. The biggest of which, of course, is the growth of the UK population, which has risen massively, particularly in the last century. Most of this, Scotland and Northern Ireland population stayed relatively stable, hasn't really risen much. Wales population has risen a little bit, but in England now there are almost twice the number of people that there were in 1900. UK population projected to increase to 70 million by 2030, and if we keep on growing at the rate that we are, by 2050 we're projected to have the highest population in all of Europe, which for a tiny island is really unthinkable. And I mean, all this is coming from good things and things that we like. You know, the fact that we have better medicine, that people are living longer, all these things are good. But they do obviously have a bit of a bite, you know, and that bite, it might not be immediately apparent to people, I think, you know, because we do still have so much of our land mass that's given over to farmland. So say if 70% of the UK is still farmland, we can't really say that the population is eating into our countryside in a direct way, but in an indirect way, of course, it is, because, you know, this, now that we are such an urban population, people rely on farmers to produce a surplus so people can eat it. So we have to farm hard to produce enough food to keep all these people going. To make things worse, as a society, we've also become increasingly wasteful about the amount of food that we buy and don't eat. From these stats, probably the key one is right at the top, that 19%. Of all the food that we buy, 19% ends up thrown away, uneaten in the bin every year. And I think if you add up the amount that goes partially eaten into the bin, you would have an even more sobering statistic. I'll let you have a quick look at these stats and then move on to the next page. Now, the problems that this food waste causes the countryside are inevitable. We were already farming hard to produce enough food for a big population, farming even harder to produce food for, so that then people have choice and end up wasting it. And the consequence, I suppose, really, the people, or the thing that really loses is the wildlife. You know, if we could cut out that 19%, imagine how much more habitat we could have for wildlife straight away. If we cut out even more, if people made better choices about their food, imagine how much more. It would benefit all of us as well. Now, in saying this again, I'm not claiming to be an expert. I waste food just as much as anyone else, you know. But when you look at how much more is being wasted year upon year by all of this, we're all throwing away our money on absolutely nothing. None of us is benefiting from it. Other things that are driving some of these problems. Again, something that's received a lot of attention, particularly recently, is farming subsidy. So first of all, after the Second World War, we had subsidies that, I suppose in a way, you know, this was maybe the start of where a lot of our wildlife problems started. So big for victory in the Second World War. After the war, rationing ends, and British government don't want people to starve again. You know, after rationing, nobody wants to go back to that, understandably. So the big focus on the countryside is trying to make agriculture as efficient as possible, trying to farm as much of it as we can, so we can produce lots of food, so people don't go back to the misery they were suffering before that. All of this is coming from a good place, not from a bad place. But this is also what led to us scrubbing out all these hedgerows, a lot more drainage of wetlands, taking fields out, trees out from the middle of fields because they were difficult to plough around. All these things really start to happen in a big, big way after that period. That's where a lot of these problems begin, and of course the wildlife suffers from that. We get the Common Agricultural Policy coming in from the EU, and again the ambition with this is good, it's noble, and it's things that we want. Common agricultural policy is basically trying to make sure that food is both available and affordable. So it's paying us as farmers to work the land, so we have local food being produced, allows us to compete with the, I suppose, new world of farming, Australia, New Zealand, places like that, that farming on a really intensive scale, sending their food over here at prices that we couldn't compete with unless we had some kind of support. So all these things are good, and it means that we can charge the consumer less for food. If we were charging according to those rising costs of production that come in with more things like insecticides and fertilizers and things like that, people wouldn't be able to afford to eat, and that would be unthinkable in a civilized society. So that's why policies like these come in. I hear a lot of people criticising subsidy and money ending up in farmers' pockets for things like this. I think that's worth bearing in mind why these subsidies exist. Another thing that I think is worth making a point about is that we expect other services to be subsidised. You know, we expect nurses, for example, to be subsidised. These are things that we want and that we need and that receive public money. You know, so should farming be any different? I don't know. Just a point. But with CAP, this noble intention, I think, was ruined quite badly by politicians. I think they botched it quite badly. First of all, what they did was they paid a subsidy per head of livestock that you owned. The result of which was that farmers, sometimes I guess through trying to get as much money as they could, but sometimes really just to survive, overstocked massively. We produced too much, inevitably a lot of that produce was wasted, and we see the big problems of eating away on habitat on farmland. So policy was changed, and instead of paying per head of livestock, farmers were paid per acre of farmable land they owned. So in some ways this was almost worse. You know, now people were being paid simply for having farmland. It didn't really matter if you had any livestock on it. If you owned a big chunk of land, you got a huge slug of subsidy. And the sad thing about this, when you hear, you know, the blame being directed at farmers, the reality is for a lot of the smaller farmers, this put them out of business. And you have these big swathes of the country, and talking about in Scotland, you know, maybe places like Galloway or way up north, where we had wildlife that was evolving alongside these hill people for centuries, and the farming methods were things that the wildlife relied on. Suddenly those people are gone, the habitats are going over, got huge armies of Sitka spruce plantations capturing the hills now. And if you think about the things that are really, really suffering in Britain, I'm thinking in particular of birds like curlews. We've removed their habitat. We've planted Sitka spruce all around them, the sort of habitat that's really only suitable for a few generalist species, most of whom unfortunately are predators for birds like curlews. You think there's no wonder that these things are in such massive decline. And you know, a lot of this is because we don't have people in the hills anymore. It's one of the sad truths about it is that people being out of the hills has been a big problem. And a lot of this has just come from policy and the way that it's been handled, unfortunately. So these things have all, I think, been a contributing factor to the decline of wildlife. Another thing as well, my screen seems to have frozen again, guys. There we go. Of course, is the rise of the supermarkets, which again have been driving down prices that people have been receiving. It's pushing people that don't have much of an option into intensifying on their farm, really just to stay alive, stay afloat and compete. When I've been talking earlier about the habitats that we have on our farm, sometimes I get a bit ahead of myself and I want to boast about how well wildlife's doing here. The reality is that we're really fortunate. This farm's been in our family for over a century. We didn't buy it and have to pay off debts by farming it as hard as we could. My parents have been, to their credit, always very forward thinking, always thinking about the fact that subsidy at some point might dry up. that we might be priced out of the market by factors beyond our control. And we've diversified a lot so that even in the worst times, we have things like a Red Kite project that will keep us going. So we've been fortunate. Also, our ground, a lot of it is pretty unimprovable. So, you know, we up on the hill there, you're not going to do anything with that. You can leave it, farm it in the only way that you can, and you can leave it for wildlife. So we are fortunate, we're in a lucky position. And if it sounds like I'm getting ahead of myself at all and bragging too much, then I have to bear that in mind and make it too, that other people haven't been as lucky as us. So the supermarkets have come in anyway, folks, bringing in a lot of produce from overseas, pushing down the prices of things, bringing in a whole new model of selling. And I think possibly this is part of the big problem, is that suddenly we have lost the relationship between producers and consumers. You go to the supermarket now and you really don't know anything about how the food was produced. And that's not just for meat. You really don't know much about how fruit and veg got there either, how well it's been farmed. An interesting book I read recently, which some of you might have read as well, is English Pastoral by James Rebanks, who is a Lake District farmer. And he made a lot of really, really good points about this, but one that really kind of resonated with me is that now a lot of our focus between kind of farmers and conservationists is about whether or not you should eat meat, but perhaps one of the other questions that we aren't asking is simply how was the food produced, how did it get to us? And it's something that we now don't know because we don't have that relationship. We've got a supermarket middleman in the middle there, and we've lost that link. We can't ask the supplier because we don't know who the supplier is. So these things have been tricky. See how we're doing for time quickly, guys. 8:15. Great. So a story that seems we have a bit of time. Wasn't planning to tell you this, but I think it kind of illustrates some of these problems quite well. A few years ago, my dad and I were in a farming business improvement group, specifically aimed at two-generation farming families. And one of the trips we did was up to a big veg producer about an hour north of here. I won't name him because I don't want to make things awkward for him or anything like that. But when you arrived on this farm, you thought, wow, to have a place like this. Huge, great big fields, perfect veg producing country, the sort of place that most people would give their right arm for. Wonderful, wonderful place. Now, this guy, he supplied a lot of veg, particularly broccoli, potatoes, and carrots to supermarkets. And again, you thought, well, okay, that sounds like good business. You know, you're in the right place here, buddy. But when we asked him a bit about what that was like, it was a real eye-opener. And you start to see how much certain farmers are really almost in the power of the supermarket. So one of the stories he told us that really shocked me was that he would have his target set out at the beginning of the growing season, so he had to plant X amount of acres of, say, roasted potatoes, what have you, and supply it to the supermarket on set dates. But if the supermarket decided they wanted a different kind of potato all of a sudden, not only would they not want that crop that he'd just harvested and he'd have to find a home for that, but he would also then, if he couldn't supply what they actually wanted, they would blacklist him for the following month. And he would then have another crop that we'd have to dump there. And again, you can see through these things, these are the things that we are, as a society, buying into, this kind of real hard-nosed business. And for us as wildlife lovers, we know what the consequences are for biodiversity from buying into this system. That's what these big businesses have created. And, you know, that story stuck with me ever since. I think it's really, really troubling. Another consequence, I think, folks, of the supermarkets and of the prices going down as a result of all these things we've spoken about is that inevitably the amount that we spend as households on food is going down quite a lot. And I'm sure that this is just since 1985. The proportion for generations before that would have been even more. Upside is that we have more money now to spend on leisure, travel, and all these things. The downside, if you're being really cynical, is a lot of these things a lot of the things we now take for granted, the leisure, the trips, the flights, and all these things are also destroying the environment. So, you know, if you take this down really to the ground level, a lot of this is related to food and the changes that have happened. And this leads me to the final part of tonight's talk, folks. What do we do to make things better? For us farmers, as Liz said in the introduction, there's an awful lot going on. One of the big things, of course, is that we have to think about emissions and what on earth we're going to do about that, how we reduce inputs and things that are going to drive up our carbon scores, make the world a worse place. I haven't said a huge amount about carbon tonight, and the reason for that is not that it's not important, but it's a very, very tricky subject, and everything that I read about it says that the science isn't there to really tell us quite how bad our carbon scores are as an industry and as individual farms. So we do have schemes like the Beef Efficiency Scheme, which has an annual carbon audit, but it's not taking in various factors about the way that we sequester carbon on places. So we really don't know yet quite what the damage we're doing is with our carbon outputs. And I think really until we get reliable scores and a reliable system, I should say, around the scores, a reliable system that tells us this a bit more clearly, until every farm is having a carbon audit that's reliably done, we don't know quite what the picture is. So we know that we have to reduce on things like putting fertilizers on and releasing all that nitrogen and harmful gases into the environment. I think we know as well that we probably need to reduce on the amount of livestock that we're producing, but we just don't know quite how much yet. So that's something that maybe for us we'll find out in the next few years, but it's something that probably at the moment I'm not qualified enough to talk about. Other things that we'll have to do again is we're going to have to think about how we feed livestock without destroying huge swathes of the rainforest to do it. Of all the sticks that people can bash farming with, this is one of the most valid ones and one that we really don't have much of a comeback against. It's the damage that we're doing to other parts of the world. We have to think about what we can do to bring back some of the habitats that we have here, some of the things that we've lost across the countryside. So our hedgerows, our trees, our wildflowers, our ponds, all these things we have to bring back. And I'm hoping that there's no farmers in the audience tonight who are going to be really angry at this. Another thing we have to consider is that we do have certain animals back in Britain and certain animals that could come back that might really help us with this. And I say that I hope farmers aren't watching this because I know that the damage that beavers can do to farmland and that they can cost people an awful lot of money. I know that they won't be for every farm. And I think this is something that government is going to have to support, going to have to pay people to compensate for the damage that's being done to their land. Otherwise, we're never going to get past the problems that we're having in areas like Tayside at the moment. But there's loads of things we can do. We can put in ponds, all these things. We can plant wildflowers, but we know that we have natural engineers that will do it a lot better than we can, more cheaply perhaps than we can. And perhaps it's something, an industry that we have to look towards now. For consumers, again, there are a lot of things that we can do. Reducing food waste, I'm sure, is going to be a huge one. We stop wasting food, we probably don't need to produce it in the first place. We all end up richer. Us as farmers, we end up with nicer farmland, better habitat. When we won't be farming it so hard, we won't be wrecking our soils to do it. We'll have a lot more wildlife around us. This is to everyone's benefit. The only people that this might harm might be big industries, the ones that really have got rich over this whole period. Fertilizer supply is the people that are selling off weed killers to supermarkets. These are the people that will be harmed by this. But for us as non-everyday people, if we can reduce the amount of food that we're wasting, it's really going to be to our benefit. I think as well, for those of us that can afford to, we should look at where we're buying our food from. I use this picture simply because it's of my cousin Jock, who I mentioned earlier, who farms up in Murray. He farms, he owns his butcher shop, his meat is all grass fed and all goes to his butcher shop. You go into the shop on Saturday, you can speak to Jock and you can find out exactly where the meat came from, how that animal lived, how it died, all the things that you couldn't do in a supermarket. At the end of the day, you go in and his butcher's counter is empty because butchers like him, I take him as an example, this should stand for any good butcher in the country. They can't afford to carry waste. They can't afford to be throwing stuff out. That's just inefficient business for them. I think we need to move back to that and realise that not everyone can afford to pay a slightly higher price for food, be it meat, fruit or veg. Some people don't have a butcher or greengrocer and such like. If you do, if it's near you and you can afford to use it, I think you should. Compare that to going in to the supermarket, as I did as the other day, and buying it there. Reared in Germany, slaughtered in Germany. What do I know about that animal, how it lived, how it died? All I know is that it's taken a lot of transport to get the thing over here, which arguably is the most harmful thing to the environment we could be doing, bringing food that we could produce here all the way over here. Makes no sense to me at all. These are things I think we can do. Writing to your politicians, the excellent Write to Them website, really useful when you want to annoy a politician, and I encourage you all to use it. Particularly at the moment, we've seen, again, as Liz said in the intro, it's the days of changing policy. England is taking a really, really strong lead on agricultural policies for the future. It looks like the direction of travel is really good for wildlife there, with a slight caveat that at the same time that we're looking to improve things in England, we're also trying to strike a trade deal with America and bring in foods that would be illegal if we were trying to produce them here, supporting a really intensive system. So we need to be careful with that, but the direction of travel purely from English farming is looking really good. For Scotland, we still don't know what's going to happen, and it's really, really important that we try and pressure the politicians into doing something that turns this around. You know, at the moment, the Scottish Government, who I admire hugely on a lot of things, but I think their environmental record is really patchy. They're pushing carbon hard in the amount of trees that are being planted, but there's not so much on biodiversity and how we turn these things around. There's a real danger that with these tree planting targets, we just end up firing up more and more trees, wrecking good habitats. The sort of things that I showed you earlier. The hill here, I'm sure a lot of politicians, a lot of rewilders would look at that and see a sheep-wrecked hill at this time of year. They wouldn't see the orchids that are going to come. They wouldn't see the owls that go there and hunt at night, the kestrels, the meadowpipits, the curlews. You don't see them unless you're there and you know how to look for them. But they're there, and there's a real risk that if we focus too much on carbon, that we could smash up a really good habitat for wildlife. So we have to be careful in what we're asking for. We have to be really careful about this soundbite that people are coming out with, that if you solve the carbon crisis, you're going to solve the biodiversity crisis, because the two are largely linked. And repairing habitats will, of course, make things better for wildlife, but we have to do it sensitively. We have to realise that the wildlife on our farms has evolved with us for centuries, evolved with our practices, and we have to do it gently. We can't just do something to knee-jerk it. Everything has to be done properly. So yes, by all means, please write to your politicians, ask for a sustainable, wildlife-friendly policy for the future. But we do have to keep in mind that we have to be sensitive in doing it. Liz mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the Nature Friendly Farming Network. I'm a member of the steering group for Scotland, and it's open to farmers. So those farmers that might be in the audience that might have been upset about the beaver chat, I hope not, but it's open to you, but it's also open to everyone. You don't have to have a farm, you just have to be in support of nature friendly farming. You can go to our website and you can sign up and join us as a non-farming member, as a supporter who wants to see more wildlife on the farm. So these things you can do as well. And the big thing, I think, folks, is that it's important to have more events like this. There's such a divide between farmers and conservationists now. And when we're all hiding behind our mobile phones and our social media accounts, conservationists can convince themselves that they hate the farmers, and by God, we convince ourselves that we hate them as well. But when we actually sit down and have events like this, I feel like the thing that comes out from them, I hope anyway, is that we want the same things broadly. The things I want are good food, good life, and a nice world that my daughter will grow up in. Those are things that are important to me, and I think they're things that are important to you too. More events like this really help. Folks, that's me for tonight. Thank you very much for listening, and pass back over to Liz and we can go on with the questions, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. Well, that was quite sobering in lots of ways, but really important as well. So thanks very much for that. There's some questions from the audience, and I'll just get onto them and have a bit of a look here. Right, so here's a question. I'm sorry, I'm glasses on and glasses off for this. Are other farmers, oh no, sorry, wrong, that wasn't the one. That one's maybe come up the top, yes. Are other farmers around you beginning to copy your good practices? How do we encourage other farmers to do the same as you?
Yeah, I think we've got lots of good farmers around us. A lot of people are farming in quite traditional ways where we are, again, for the same reason that in a lot of ways on the hills here, you don't have a lot of choice but to farm it in the way that it always has been run. So yeah, a lot of them are following very similar practices and doing a good job. I think in terms of encouraging other people, my suspicion is that farmers will do what the policy tells them to do. I know that for a lot of people, the idea of continuing to subsidise farming is a difficult one to get their head around, but realistically, I think the best way to get these changes done as quickly as possible, and we know that these changes have to come quickly, is to pay farmers to run their land in the right way. So I think writing to MSPs, joining organisations like the Nature Friendly Farming Network are really, really important. And of course, supporting organisations like the Scottish Wildlife Trust and the RSPB that are backing these as well is important too. I think perhaps the big thing that comes out from all this, including things like the supermarkets and things like that, is that we have to actually make voices heard now. We can't keep on going passively on with this. I think we have to really kind of vote with our money and put the pressure on as much as possible.
Okay, thank you for that. Guy, did you want to comment on that?
No.
No. Okay, that's fine. Thank you then. Next question is from Jan Harbidge. Do you organise tours of the farm other than for the red kites?
Yes, we do. Well, in a normal year we would. At present, we've had to close because we're in Tier 4, and we're very much hoping that when restrictions allow, we will be able to open back up again. And the plan will be that we'll be doing nature-friendly farming tours in particular, and you'll get my dad, who's someone far more qualified than I am to talk about any of this stuff, going out and taking people around. We've got a multi-person all-terrain buggy, which would take people all around the farm, and we show people the way that we farm it, tell them some of the old stories about the hills and the people that used to live there. They were really fun, and we're hoping to get back to that. So we'll be doing that. We're about to open up a new red squirrel hide where we'll take people out and do a week tour, show people the squirrels and the woodland birds before we go up and do the red kite tour. So we'll be doing that, and then come the summertime again, we'll be doing our summer walks and hopefully evening talks again, all being well, if people are allowed indoors again by then. We'll be doing things like pond dipping, dragonfly walks, all these sorts of things. Yeah, so we hope that all being well, we'll be able to open up again and start doing some of this stuff soon. All of it will be on social media, so keep an eye on there, or just get in touch with us through the website, and we'll be able to keep you updated on where we're at with that.
Okay, thank you. Right, the next one's more of a comment than a question, but I'll just read it out. It's from Ian Maynard. There's a need to be careful how the statistics are framed. This was about food waste. 19% may be the proportion lost that we buy from what we buy from the consumer. However, the total wasted along the whole supply chain is closer to 30%. And the precise, right, and the precise,
sorry, go on.
Yeah, the precise balance between the farm, processor and consumer depends on the geographical area. In Western Europe, we waste more on the consumer side relative, say, to Asia. That's interesting information.
Well, it's a good point, and actually, as well as that, I mean, like Ian, I've read a few statistics that will put it between 20 and 30%, but on that, on those statistics, it didn't include restaurant waste as well, which must be a huge one when you consider that the standard British meal is piling the plate as high as possible. How many of us finish what's on our plate in a restaurant? You know, so yeah, we're wasting a lot. I think those are conservative estimates for sure.
Okay, thank you. Right, so from Hannah, how often do you check your cattle over winter when they're grazing the hills? And what method do you use to do this? I've heard a lot of farmers are utilising drones to check on their livestock.
Nothing as fancy as that, I'm afraid. Just going out and counting them each day and having a look at them and seeing what kind of condition they're in is about as far as we go, I'm afraid.
Okay, and from M, will the new recognition that undisturbed soil is important for carbon capture more than trees result in benefit to the way that you farm?
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to be a big focus for us and for all farmers, actually. It seems more and more that soil health is the thing that's going to govern how well we farm our places and how well we do for the environment. We're already looking at we've already started, I should say, doing more strict grazing with electric fences. The idea being a bit like a tree, that we know that trees soak up a lot of carbon when they're growing, but start to let it out again when they finish growing. The idea is to try and keep grass in the growing stage, not let it come to a head and then start stop being a sink. You know, you want to keep it being a sink for as long as possible. So that's something that we're already doing, and yeah, again, I think we'll look to maximise on that with the new grass as well.
Okay, thank you. Can I just be cheeky here and put in a wee comment of my own that more for reasons of age than for reasons of carbon capture, I've started doing no-dig vegetable growing in my garden and have been find it quite remarkable how it doesn't seem to cause any problems at all. So if any of your gardeners, you might want to experiment with doing no-dig gardening on a mini version of not ploughing so much. Right. What's the, so here's a question from Sue. What's the benefits or cost of silage versus hay?
Well, nutritional value would be higher. I think this is probably getting me out of my comfort zone a little bit with my lack of farming knowledge. The other thing as well is that you can bale silage in a damper state and wrap it up. So it's easier to get a good crop of silage than it is to get the hay, and you know, you're not always chasing the weather in the way that you used to do in the old times. So I think that's probably as much as anything, it's a convenience thing, really. I couldn't tell you much more, to be honest, so beyond that. That's definitely taking me beyond my level of knowledge.
Okay. Can nitrogen fixing plants reduce the amount of fertilizer that you need? This is from Neil Kitching.
Yeah, absolutely, Neil. Yeah, that's definitely something that people are doing. And again, you know, a lot of these things will depend on your type of farm as to how much you're obviously able to do, you know, what kind of land you have, what altitude you're at. But absolutely, if you can get natural alternatives to putting artificial nitrogen onto the ground, then that's great. And that's very much obviously what we're trying to do by putting in things like clover into the mix and natural supply of that. And as mentioned earlier, having a lot of vegetation around the field, we'll add a small amount, you know, nothing huge, but a small percentage to the field as well.
Right. Thank you. From D, where is it possible to buy the meat from your farm?
Well, interesting you asked that. My dad and I were talking about this just 2 days back, actually, about whether we would try and start to do direct selling to the customers again. It's something that my parents used to do during foot and mouth. We were getting, actually, was it during foot and mouth, or was it during BSE? One or the other, anyway. It was some crisis that devastated our lives on a regular basis in that period. But they were already getting a terrible price for the produce from the supermarkets, and then this big crisis hit, and they started doing farmers markets and selling direct to people. They started doing meat boxes, and I think it's something that we will look to do again sometime soon, probably doing lamb boxes and such like. At the moment, the difficulty we have is that there's a big wait for private slaughters at the local slaughterhouse for these things. So it's something probably we'll look at again next year when that kind of calms down a bit. I think one of the positives perhaps of the whole coronavirus period is that because we don't have money, we have money, but we don't have anything to spend it on. People are spending a lot more on better food. Our local butcher is saying that his business has never been better as a result. So that, you know, is creating a bit of a waiting time for people trying to set up their own selling businesses. But it's definitely something we would look at. And it would actually, if people had the time and the information, we would be kind of interested to know if they didn't mind contacting us, maybe through social media or through the website, just to let us know as a rough idea if people would be interested in this. You know, you would know where the meat was coming from, how it was produced, all these things we've talked about tonight. So it would be buying meat with a story. But we want to know that people are actually interested in it before we commit down another diversification, because we're running quite a few already.
Okay. Next question is from Ailsa Power. Does harrowing the ground destroy the soil ecosystem? She says, I harrow after my Exmoor ponies have grazed an area over winter.
Again, probably a bit out of my comfort level to be able to answer that accurately, but I don't think it should be anything like as destructive as the fire would be. You know, and again, when I'm slagging off ploughing, please don't think that, you know, I'm totally trying to do away with ploughing. It turns out that, you know, sometimes we should be looking at alternatives to it. But no, I don't think it'll be anything like as destructive as putting the plough through. But probably, again, not too qualified to answer that too accurately, I'm afraid.
Okay, try this one then. Eileen Waddington, you spoke about your cows, but you didn't say very much about your sheep. How have you changed how you manage your sheep in any way?
No, sheep management, I mean, we have changed breeds a little bit. In the early days, we used to run black-faced sheep up on the hill there, and over the years, we've moved more down into the grass parks and changed. We had clean sheep, a Welsh breed for a while, and Cheviots. We still have the clins, but they're going to Texel tups now. In terms of how we manage them, which is different, yeah, we're down on the grass parks now, trying to make use of the better land for this better breed. Blackies were fine up on the hill; they do quite well, largely left to their own devices. But down in the grass parks, we're trying to be more efficient, I suppose, using the better grass, and it means that with these breeds of sheep, where the black-faced a lot of time you see them disappearing off when you go near them. You know, they're very, very flighty, very independent. With these other breeds, it's a lot easier to work with them and manage them. So it means that we can, in lambing time, you know, catch them if they need to be caught, if they need help with lambing, we can have a more efficient lambing time as well. Another thing that we'll look to start doing a bit more of is what's called a follower leader system of grazing, where, again, to try and keep the grass growing, you send cows in first and they'll graze to a certain height off the ground. Cows don't graze right the way down to the ground. but then you can send the sheep in afterwards and they'll make better use of the grass. They'll graze it right the way down. You can keep it growing in a better state there, but you make better use of it in a strip grazing system. So that's something that we'll be looking to do with the new grass as well.
Okay, fine. So I'm going to take a question from further down. It's a factual question from Jackie Robinson. You mentioned a book that you read recently. Could you give the author and title again, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's a book by James Rebanks, Rebanks, and it's called English Pastoral. And for me, it was a bit of a revelation, really. A lot of the stuff that I've talked about tonight has come from that, and just seeing, you know, that this is what happens. I think when you're involved in conservation and farming, it could be a bit of a difficult one, you know. When I'm in a room with farmers, I feel like the most radical person there, and when I'm in a room with conservationists, I feel like the most conservative. It's a hard balance, and a lot of the time you do feel this real guilt about what farming's doing to the world because of what you receive in the media and social media. And it was nice to read a book that was written by someone that you felt like you knew that you would get on with, that would understand things, and that all of this, he was basically writing about the changes in global agriculture as they played out in a small family Lake District farm, with the improvements they tried to make to keep up, and the sudden realization that the things they were doing and the other farms around them were doing were wrecking soils, reducing biodiversity, changing the landscape out of recognition. It was really interesting. It really just, although the landscape there is different from here, you know, a lot of home truths there. It's a really worthwhile read for people that want to know about this history. Again, another big point that came out from it was he said at one point, blaming the farmers for all this is like blaming the person that works on the till in the supermarket. I think that's a bit extreme. I think some farmers could have done better, should be doing better, but I think there is a certain truth to this as well, that, you know, the real kind of problems in this are the people that are really getting rich from it, you know, the big business. I think that's what's driving it more than anything else. So it's an interesting read. I do encourage people to read it. He talks a lot of sense.
Okay, now there's two more, so we're nearly at the end of these. I'm going to take a comment, an information comment from Ailsa Power, who had a question in earlier. She says, silage is much richer nutritionally than hay, so more economic for cows. Good hay is much more weather dependent and difficult to store well. Also, you can get more crops of silage per season than hay, and that is just a following up from a question that came earlier. Okay, now I'm going to finish on a question from Walter Atwood. And actually, Walter was one of the people who was asking us to have a farming related topic. But I think he's got a really hard question and for us to finish on. So Stirling Methodist Church marks Plough Sunday in February, and in the light of what we're talking about, ploughing not being such a good idea, could you suggest an alternative name?
I think I might leave that open to the group to decide. But thank you for the question. Just to make one point as well about the silage versus hay thing, guys, another point that might be worth kind of consideration. It's a bit off topic, but one downside of silage is that to keep it, we either need to have silage pits or we need to wrap it in black plastic. So although silage is more efficient for us to use and for the livestock to use, there is a downside that we are producing more plastic, and there's a real problem at the moment with trying to get rid of that in this country, because a lot of that was being shipped out to China, I believe. So now they're having problems with that because of global relations, and the company that come to collect our black plastic, they basically won't take anything unless it's absolutely clean to take it away, because it's costing them money to try and get rid of it now. They can only get rid of the very best plastic. So there is a bit of an issue there. quite what on earth you do about it, I really don't know, because, you know, silage obviously is reducing your need for bringing in other feeds. So with a lot of this stuff, you're talking about trying to make compromises and balances, and there may not be a perfect situation, and maybe the silage one illustrates that as well as anything else. For Elizabeth Swain, just to say that again, it's called James Rebanks, and it's called English Pastoral.
I would call that pastoral. So maybe that's easier to hear. I'm just saying that to make it easier to hear. Pastoral. Okay. So can I thank you very, very much, Tom, partly for entering the lion's den with us conservationists. I hope we haven't been too challenging tonight. It's been really interesting. It's a very different kind of talk than we usually have. We often try in our winter season to have a talk that's of a different kind. So you've really done that for us. Lots to think about. And I would be like Tom and say, often the best way to do things is to write to or meet your MSP. It's not hard to do. And if you've got a strong opinion about something, it can be good for your blood pressure to do it as well. Not that they always vote for what you would like them to, but unless you tell them, they're not going to know what you're thinking at home. So I would say that for any of your representatives, for your local councillors, your MSPs, and for your MPs, but for agriculture in Scotland, it's MSPs that are the one. So do feel free and use some of the information that you've learned from Tom tonight, if you like. Okay, I think we're just rounding up then now, everybody. So thank you very much. Thank you for your questions from the audience. Thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you again sometime. Okay, thank you. Just finish this up here. Is that you, Guy, doing that?
Yep, I'll end it now. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.